You can ask Sara to text it to you. But also we have the one printed copy. So I think everyone's set now. Okay, you're starting.
Okay. Hi, everyone in the room and on the screen. Really happy that you're with us tonight. I apologize for the printing error, but glad that we're here. And truth is, we'll say everything that's important anyway. Just very briefly, the whole series is Women and Mitzvot for everyone. Many schools for women have classes about women and mitzvot and sort of go through those topics. Many women are fairly knowledgeable, or at least haven't encountered many of these topics before, and many men go through their lives with a lot of ignorance about these topics. And so that's like part of why we wanted to kind of address this topic for everyone, because actually men and women are Jews who have mitzvot to do, and we should all, and learning about our different obligations and our different ways in which we do mitzvot is actually, it's Torah for everyone. So in that sense, that's another reason why we think this is relevant. So let's dive in and get started. First topic is Kiddush. The source for the mitzvah of reciting Kiddush is a verse in Exodus, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadsho, which is often translated as remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Zachor often in the Torah means remember, but how do we remember? What's the way in which we remember? How do we like more actively fulfill a command to remember? Oh, sorry. And this is also relevant coming up. We have Shabbat Zachor in another 2 weeks, 3 weeks, soon. Okay, 2 weeks. We put Shabbat before Purim, where we fulfilling a command to remember Amalek, and that too. So, and all of these cases, it seems that, look at source 2. This is the Sifra. This is the Midrash Halacha. Zachor Yom HaShabbat lekadsho yachol bilvavecha. Could it only be to remember in your heart? But it says Shamor in Deuteronomy. In other words, in Exodus, when the Ten Commandments are described, we're told to remember the Sabbath day. In Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments are repeated. We're told to keep the Sabbath day. So keeping the Sabbath day certainly entails actions. It must be that remembering the Sabbath day also entails actions, okay? So it must be, sorry, the opposite. When it says shamor, that means to keep it in one's heart. Hamani makayam zachor shetehei shoneh b'ficha. So it must be, since they're the two different words, it must be that zachor, zachira, is not just remembering, but I would let me translate it as like recounting, mentioning. Okay, so zachor yom Shabbat lekadsho means to mention the Sabbath day, to sanctify it. And one way in which we do this actually. Every Shachrit, we say the Shir Shel Yom, the song of the day. Even just on a weekday, when we say today is the 4th day of the week, we say Yom Revi'i Lishabbat. So that mentioning of Shabbat, counting the days of the week oriented around Shabbat, according to some, is a fulfillment of Zachor Yom HaShabbat lekadsho. And the other way that we do so is through, as we'll see, through Kiddush. So look at source 3. This is the Gemara in Shavuot. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And it says, observe, Zachor and Shamor, the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So these were spoken in one utterance. So in Hebrew, Zachor v'Shamor b'dibur echad ne'emru. This is maybe familiar to some of us from the verse in Lechad Odi, Shamor v'Zachor b'dibur echad, right? That these two were, right, the version of the Ten Commandments in Exodus, version of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy were said at once. Masha'ein yachol apel daber, right? So that, and masha'ein ha'ozin yachol lishma. So that actually
said in exactly the way that no one can say it and no one can hear it.
Right. So it can't be like, you could try it, right? Try saying, Zachor and Shamor at the same time. Like you can't, right? And if half of us say Zachor and half of us say Shamor, you won't hear anything, right? So that doesn't seem to, so at least in a literal sense, it doesn't seem to make sense. So the Gemara says, so granted, today I remember an observer spoken in single utterance or to teach the halacha. So it's really, they were said together to teach us halacha. The Ada Bar Abba says, which is as follows. Women are obligated to recite Kiddush sanctifying the seventh day by Torah law, even though, well, now, even though it's what? Right, correct. By Torah law, since it says remember and observe. Okay, so in Hebrew we'll say again, so it's Nashim chayavot b'kiddush hayom dvar Torah. So this mitzvah of kiddush hayom, women have a Torah obligation to fulfill because Zachor and Shemor were set as one. And what's the drasha? What's the learning that he's making? He's saying kosha yeshna b'shmira yeshna b'zachira b'haninashi ha'il v'itzneu b'shmira itzneu nami b'zachira. So let's unpack that. He is working off a paradigm that Zachor at Yom HaShabbat, to remember the Sabbath day, is a positive obligation to mention the Sabbath, to sanctify the Sabbath day, whereas Shemor at Yom HaShabbat is a prohibition against all of the malachot, all of the violations of Shabbat. That's his background. He's further seems to be assuming, this is the non-bold lines on the source sheet,
Which we'll talk about in the next Gemara.
Which we'll talk about the next Gemara. So he knows the next Gemara. So he's also assuming that there might be, and so I'll sort of say this quickly because it'll get to the next Gemara, but he's assuming that you might think that women aren't obligated in this positive obligation to recite Kiddush, for a reason we'll see in the next Gemara, but women certainly are obligated equally as men in all of the prohibitions of Shabbat. And so there's a special teaching. The Torah is coming to say, Shemor v'zachor b'dibur echad, so that since we know women and men equally have to obey the prohibitions of Shabbat, women too are obligated in this positive obligation of Shabbat as the Chord Yom Shabbat L'Kadsho. I think maybe now segue to, okay.
Right. Well, so I think, I would take it in a different direction. I would say the Gemara says women are obligated in keeping in Shamor and in Zachor, and that's going to include Kiddush. And, you sort of have to ask yourself at any point when the Gemara says women are obligated. So is that just because, they're sort of strange creatures, and who knows what would happen with women if we didn't say they were obligated, right? It's just it's a thing for everyone else, but it's a big mystery what would happen, right? So that's that might sometimes be true. We can talk about times when that's true. But there could also be, as David said, a paradigm where the Gemara is thinking, oh, you might really actually have a reason to think that women are not obligated here. Now, I actually think it may be more the first than the second here, because the Gemara doesn't say, right, there's no explicit straw man argument in the Gemara in Shavuot, right? It doesn't say why you would think that women wouldn't be obligated. It just says, by the way, women are obligated. And so, yeah.
I guess I don't know why, but I got the impression that usually, in a collective of men and women, men are the ones who say that it's a man who's usually saying the Kiddush. So I just was kind of curious based on what we just discussed. Is there sort of an order of hierarchy that way, or no?
So we'll get there. So so the first step is Kiddush, because I actually think it's just not, we don't talk about it so much, why you would even recite Kiddush, and what that even is. So now you've got Kiddush. And then the question is, who's obligated? So now the answer is everybody, or everybody adult. Although actually this Gemara doesn't really make that explicit. Elsewhere it discusses that adult Jews are obligated in Kiddush. So that's step number 2. And now Susan has a really good question. Okay, so if everybody's obligated, topless, who's going to say it, right? So that is definitely the next question. But just to unpack that underlying assumption a little bit, the Gemara in Shavuot does not talk about it. The Gemara in Brachot explicitly says, Nashim chayavot b'kiddush hayom dvar Torah. Women are obligated on a Torah level in making Kiddush. And then the Gemara asks, Amai mitzvah aseh man gramahu, right? That it is a positive time-bound mitzvah. V'chol mitzvah aseh shehazman grama nashim p'turot. And any positive time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt from. You know how they say rules are meant to be broken? This rule never even got that far, right? This, it's a rule that's not a rule. It's really interesting. I mean, a lot of rules in the Gemara are like that. They're sort of presented as it's like a rule that gets posited and then doesn't actually get really fully put into effect. So, in some settings, we might say everybody knows. I'm not sure everybody knows. Everybody knows that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot. If you skip to source number 5, what everyone doesn't know but really should. This is from a great article by Rabbi Saul Berman. Women are obligated to fulfill as many positive precepts limited as to time as the number from which they are exempted. We can do the math at different times.
It's not just a 1-for-1.
It's like literally, it's not even half and half, right? There are more positive time-bound mitzvot in which women are obligated than there are from which women are exempt, right? Which means that as a rule, that's predictive, it's a really bad rule, right? I don't mean that in like a judgy way, like I don't, not just that like I think it's a bad rule. It's like actually just a bad rule.
But
Yeah.
is it, so there doesn't have to be a directly related negative, like with matzah, you can't eat chametz, so you have to eat matzah. And here it's, so here, because you can't desecrate the Shabbat.
Yeah,
you
it's
have
a
to
great question.
sanctify it.
Right. So the question is like, doesn't there have to be like a direct reason to get out of it? I mean, yes, right. Sort of, so that's sort of the game that the Gemara plays. It's like, each time it's like, well, you would think that that women are exempt because it is a positive time by mitzvah, but actually, no, because matzah, because this, because that, right? But
I don't understand this. What is he? I don't get what he's saying.
so if you think about the idea that there is a rule
Yeah.
that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot,
Right.
so then you would expect that rule to be somewhat predictive, right? That in general, right? I would say to you, Sara, here's a positive time-bound mitzvah. Do you think women are obligated? So you're exempt from it, right? But actually, you would do worse on a multiple choice test than like average chance would indicate, because actually there are more positive time-bound mitzvot in which women are obligated.
There are more exceptions than cases that fit the rule.
Right.
Oh.
So it's
Oh.
it's a rule. It's just a rule with more exception.
It's a rule for exception.
That's why I said like they say rules are made to be broken.
It's not
I think maybe rule is like the wrong way to talk about it, even though we do talk about it as a rule, but it's
Right.
probably,
Uh,
I would
You're-
say like a concept, right? It's like
Rabbanit Sara,
it's an idea.
Actually applies less than.
I think it's like a concept that's designed to spark conversations. And actually maybe at a different time we'll have a class on mitzvah seshas my grandma, but eyes on the prize, but Kiddush, right? So that's really important to like come in with that.
Sorry, is Saul
Yeah.
Rabbi Berman saying this because he's counted?
Yes.
and then
Yes.
He's, okay.
Yes.
So this isn't like from a source.
No.
No,
He's
no,
like,
he
well,
counted.
actually, if you look at the
He has like
numbers-
he has a great footnote here where he lists all of
It's
the
like 10
cases,
footnotes, yeah.
all the cases that fit the rule, and then all the like.
Right.
We should name like one or two exemptions.
I know. Right. So I mean matzah is a good example. Right?
The obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach is a positive time-bound mitzvah. Women are obligated to eat matzah.
Yeah.
For example.
Lighting Shabbos candles is either, as I always tell my children, you have two options for who's obligated in Shabbos candles, and they are who might be obligated in Shabbos candles.
I heard you say
Very
this.
important in my life. What? Definitely not. Who might be obligated in Shabbos candles? You have two options. It's either everyone or no one, right? Because there is no mitzvah to light Shabbos candles. Okay, so either men
It's a
and
mitzvah to
women.
have light in your house on
Yes,
Shabbat. There's no-
so
okay,
either
okay.
men and women are obligated, or nobody's obligated. Those are your options for Shabbos candles. Shabbos candles doesn't make the list because it's not
Not a
a
Torah
mitzvah. It's not a
mitzvah.
mitzvah. Say it's not a positive mitzvah, time bound or otherwise, which is really interesting.
Bracha is
What?
not. It's a post-Talmudic bracha.
It's a very complicated.
Very
bracha.
complicated. It's a great topic for maybe next. Okay.
I know it's a great. Yeah.
All the exceptions that he has in the one
Mhm.
category
Yeah.
listed as exceptions, or some of them assumptions?
No.
Like, like.
No,
like
no
a-
assumptions. No
what?
assumptions.
They're all.
They're explicit in the
presented
Gemara.
as-
In
Yeah.
the Talmud, it says this is
Yes.
even though it's a mitzvah seishma
Yes.
grama, women still have to do it for.
They're all
Mhm.
present. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's a lot we could talk about in terms of rules in the Talmud and also like conceptualization, right? The work that the Talmud does to create rules as opposed to the Mishnah, which doesn't create rules. It's casuistic. It gives you case law, right? That's also a really fun topic. Okay, we have so many more things to teach about. But I do think that Rabbi Berman's point, like once you realize that, you're like, oh, like it's really different than the way things get talked about. And then you can come back into the Gemara in Brachot and see that, like, and this is the way in which, like, a little bit it is a rule. It's that the Gemara gets a little bit worked up about it. They're like, wait a second, right? It doesn't fit the paradigm. Okay, most things don't fit the paradigm, but fine. And so Abaye and Rava go back and forth here. And Abaye says, well, maybe women are only obligated rabbinically, right? And then it would be, okay, so women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot on a Torah level, but, just rabbinically they're obligated. It's like a little out. And Rava says, no, it's not going to work because, first of all, literally the statement was Dvar Torah. The first statement in this Gemara, Rav Ada bar Abba says women are obligated from the Torah. That's one problem, right? Another problem is like that's not our paradigm for rabbinic mitzvot. Whatever, that's not such a strong argument, but the really strong argument is he says, Zachor v'shamor, kol sheyeshno b'shmira, yeshno b'zechira, right? If you're obligated in one half of Shabbat, you're obligated in the other half. Again, they were said as one, and so it just can't be. And so women have to be obligated in Kiddush. And that is in fact the final word. And I don't know, there are no subsequent sources that argue that women are not obligated in Kiddush. Okay, that's from this point on in the conversation, we're going to assume that's off the table because it's off the table. Justin, you have a question.
I do too. Oh. I have
Go
a
ahead,
comment.
No, I'm gonna lower my hand because I was gonna go down the rabbit hole of categorization.
Okay.
Let's not go down the
Barry,
rabbit
go
hole here.
ahead.
Rabbi Rabbanit. You hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
Hi. You know that I study Rashi commentary when I study Chumash, right? So that being said, I believe Rashi comments that Zachor and Shamar, he implies or he says it outright that one means study, the other means do
Yeah.
or teach. So
It's definitely, there's a lot of different paradigms for what Zachor and Shamor could mean. So hold that thought and we'll try to circle back at the end. But I think, you're right. Rashi is one of many who try to explain that duality, right? So one way to see it is the positive mitzvot and the negative mitzvot. And again, we're now like, it's off the table, the idea that women, actually, Barry, you preempted me. I didn't put Rashi on the Torah here, but we put Rashi on the Gemara on this source sheet.
I beg your pardon.
Who just kind of like, no, thank you. Who just kind of amplifies that idea. So now the question is really going to be Susan's question, right? The question is just, okay, so now we're like in the realm of like everyone's obligated. And now the question is going to be, okay, so if everyone's obligated, who's going to make Kiddush? That's the question on the table. But before we answer that, I have to say one more thing about Kiddush. How many times do we say Kiddush on Shabbat? Twice. Let's talk about those Kiddushes. What happens Friday night? Kiddush, you're all looking at me like,
Not your question, not your question.
Not a trick question, right? There's a formula for Kiddush Friday night. We could sing it right now. We're not going to. You can all hum it to yourselves. Okay. That's Friday night Kiddush. It's pretty standardized. Of course, it also includes within it the blessing of Borei Pri Hagafen, which you have to say in order to be able to drink the wine or the grape juice. Right? That's just like, you would need to say that also on a Tuesday if you were to drink wine or grape juice. That's not the Kiddush part of Kiddush.
Right? Make it right, like if you make Kiddush over challah, if you have no wine or grape juice, or you're Nazir, you make Kiddush over challah, you would say hamotzi.
Right.
Or
some other drink. So that's Kiddush Friday night. What about Shabbat day? What do we say on Shabbat day?
Kiddush Rabbah.
All sorts of variations, right? Exactly. Kiddush Rabbah. So the Gemara in Pesachim starts from a very, I think at this point, familiar place with the idea that you have to remember, how do you remember Shabbat? By making Kiddush, right? So Chrehu al Hayayin, fine. And then the Gemara says, Ein li ela bayom, balayla minayin. It's very interesting. The Gemara starts from the assumption, when would you make Kiddush on Shabbat? If you only knew about one Kiddush, which Kiddush would you know about? Daytime, because what does the verse say? Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Right? Remember the Shabbat day. So, okay, I know Jewish days start at night, but still, like daytime is daytime. So, Balayla Minayin, how do you know that you have to say Kiddush at night also? And then the Gemara says, Adarabba, Ikar Kiddush Balayla Hu Kaddish. No, actually, the essence of Kiddush is at night. Dechi Kaddish Tchilat Yom Abai LeKiddusha. Just kidding. The beginning of Jewish days is at night. And so even though it says Yom, it means Lila, which is okay, because it's the Gemara, right? So it says day, it means night. It's when the day starts at night. And so really, 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 when you have to make Kiddush is nighttime. And you already kind of had an inkling of that because like you all know what Friday night Kiddush is. And Sara, you said like Shabbat day, it's like lots of options, right? So many to choose from. And so that's like the secondary Kiddush. And the Gemara, in fact, tells a story. Rav Ashi Igla Machoza. Rav Ashi went to Machoza, a big center of Jewish learning. Amrule, Likdashlan Mar Kiddush Rabbah. And they said to him, the master should make Kiddush Rabbah, should make the great Kiddush.
The grand Kiddush.
The grand Kiddush.
Kiddush deluxe.
And so, like, imagine this, right? You're like the invited scholar, you have come to visit, and they're like, please recite the prayer. You know, the prayer. And he's like, what prayer? Savar Maini Kiddush Rabbah. So he thinks to himself, right? This is the silent dialogue. He doesn't say this out loud. What's the great Kiddush? Amar Mikse Kol Brochot Kulan Bori Priyagafen Ami Beresha. Amar Bori Priyagafen Va'agiba. So he's like, well, I know that we always start with Bori Priyagafen, like that just makes sense. So like that'll be like a great starting place, right? So so he made a Bori Priyagafen. And then he just sort of like kept going. He like lengthened it maybe. Agibe, he like stretched it out. Like maybe he's like doing some chazanut, right? To like see what would happen. And then he sees that there's like an elder man there who like starts drinking, and he's like, oh, I guess I made Kiddush. Good job. Okay, and then he says, like, you know, smart people, whatever, the wise man, his eyes are in his head. He's like, good that I was like keeping an eye on things because like I figured it out. Which is to say that there is not a set liturgy, according to the Gemara, for Kiddush Rabbah, for daytime Kiddush, which you anyway all knew because sometimes people get up and say Savri and then Bori Priyagafen, and sometimes people have different like sort of prelude paragraphs that they say, but it's not like Friday Night Kiddush.
There's never a bracha.
Right, there's not an additional bracha. Yeah, exactly. And even there's like variation in terms of like the paragraph that people say. And the Ran commenting on this, the Ran Rabbi Nisim Verona, who is a major Talmud commentary and kind of pulls everything together. I'm not going to read it inside for time, but he basically says, yeah, listen, like you don't have to really know anything. You don't need any background. You could just like sort of figure it out. Kiddush has to have Bori Priyagafen, and it's the whole point, as we now know from looking at that first verse and the first Sifra, is to remember Shabbat, is to sanctify Shabbat, to make Shabbat special in some way. So like, you know, if you were to come up with like a formula, right? Like formula would be like something nice plus Bori Priyagafen equals Kiddush. And so like that's basically what we do. He says we only recite songs over wine, so you should make, you know, you can kind of say something and then you make the Bori Priyagafen. And then he says, and this is why I wanted to bring this verse, the Karahu Kiddush Rabbah, the Kinui. We call it the Great Kiddush. It's a nickname. It's like a cute nickname. Lefisha Eino Ikar Kiddush Shalayla, because it's actually not as important as the nighttime Kiddush. And so it's like the Gemara refers to blind people as Sagina Hor, full of light. That word is like a terminology for a kind of, there's a word for it in English.
Euphemism.
It's a euphemism. It's like you say the opposite. It's more than a euphemism. Okay, maybe there's not a better word in English, but anyway, right? That's Lashon Sagina Hor.
An ironic. Right?
I think it's meant to be like respectful. Anyway, we call it Kiddush Rabbah because it isn't, is the point, right? That's specifically the thing that it isn't is great, and so we call it the Great Kiddush.
Like oxymoron? Two words. It's not supposed to be Rabbah.
It's an oxymoron. I think it's just a compensation. Yeah,
Just a thought.
Or
It's like
a consolation name.
a consolation prize. It's a name that's a consolation prize.
Sounds like the sun and the moon.
And so we get to this point of I wanted to see this in the episode. We get to this point of, okay, so you have Kiddush at night, you have Kiddush during the day. Men and women are equally obligated in Kiddush. And in fact, most of the sources that discuss this, most of the Rishonim, so the medieval sources that talk about this topic, they tend not to focus on, you could see it one of two ways. Either they're not focusing on the difference between the two Kiddushes, day and night, or maybe they are assuming that they're the same, and that's why they're not focusing on it. And most of the sources, we could have brought you a lot more. I almost did put in a lot more, but David convinced me to delete some of them. They mostly say, yeah, men and women are obligated, and so women can fulfill the obligation for men. So if you look at source number 9, the Rav Yah of Kiddush hayom mafki l'gavrei, right? Women can fulfill the obligation on behalf of men because, and it quotes the Gemara that we saw, and again and again, we see this in sources that women can fulfill the obligation for men, which is, I just want to say, like, that's how you would expect it to work, because the general rules are bad. We just talked about that. The general rule is that if men and women are equally obligated, or just any two people who are equally obligated in something, one person can fulfill that obligation on behalf of the other. And when it becomes complicated is if they don't share the same obligation. So as a general rule, when sources talk about one person not being able to fulfill the obligation on behalf of another person, it's because they're assuming that those two people don't share the same obligation. But as they already mentioned, there is no one who disagrees about women being fully obligated in Kiddush. There are a few sources about, well, maybe daytime Kiddush is like a little bit different, but it's not really clear why it would be. However, you do have a few sources, really just a few, 1 or 2, like source number 8, which again, I'd say is like a partial answer to your question, Susan, maybe, from the Sefer Ha'itim, which I forget is 12th century, 13th century. I think that's right. V'li itz mirabanan. I have a tradition from the rabbis that since a woman is obligated to say Kiddush, Isha mevarech l'ba'ala. A woman could make Kiddush for her husband, ela shehi meguneh, but it wouldn't be a nice thing to do. It would be like, so he doesn't say why. And I would say this is when we talk about Megillah, in a few weeks, whenever that is, you'll see this really clearly, that again, like the first conversation you always have to have is like, do they have the same obligation? And then once you establish that they have the same obligation, if you want to knock women out of the picture, the only way you can do it is to say that there's something else wrong. And in this case, I think it's actually interesting that he says specifically, that he's specifically talking about a woman and her husband, and it's not woman and man in like a generic sense. And I don't think this from reading the Sefer Ha'itim, who really doesn't give an indication. I think this from reading other similar sources from around the same time period, that I think it's because the implication would be that the husband didn't know how to recite Kiddush, that she's sort of putting him down by reciting Kiddush for him, which maybe would make sense if you're in a societal context where generally men are expected to know how to read Hebrew and do ritual things. And generally that's not an expectation of women, which I think was probably true in like the 12th, 13th century, right? In a way that it's not today, but was then. But he's an outlier. But I think what's interesting is that, right, even he who doesn't seem comfortable with the practice still agrees on the fundamentals, right? That women and men are equally obligated. And this is pretty much the way that the thread of Psak Halacha, the thread of halachic decisors, goes on into the future. So if you want to talk about those. Right.
So we'll go on into the future. Yeah, I had a little bit of I was inspired to push back a little bit on your assumption that like in the 12th, 13th century, I think there was probably some diversity even in the Middle Ages in different places. Like the Rav Yah, for example, endorses women making Kiddush. It doesn't have that. So did women make Kiddush in Germany and not in other places? Or maybe he just didn't feel the need to,
maybe he's just writing like a theoretical essay.
Yeah.
Right?
So we don't,
it's hard to say.
Yeah, it is hard to say, but I think that we do know there was a lot of diversity in terms of different times. Like the Middle Ages is like a very different, whatever. There was, especially in terms of gender roles within Jewish society and in the Middle Ages. So we're jumping ahead now to kind of, we saw some of the primary sources. We saw how they were shown in the early medieval sources, interpreted, understood, made sense of those primary sources. And now, starting with source 11, we have like the codification of halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch, the sort of our basic book of Psak Nashim Chayvot B'Kiddush Af Al Pi Shehu Mitzvat Aseh Shezman Grama. So the Shulchan Aruch, women are obligated in Kiddush even though it's a positive time-bound mitzvah. Shulchan Aruch hadn't read Rabbi Berman's essay, so he there's an assumption you might think that women are exempt, but no, they are obligated. Mishum de'itkesh zachor l'shamor, because the Torah connects zachor and shamor, because in the two iterations of the Sara Dibrot it says zachor and shamor. V'hani nashi ho'il v'yitneu b'shmira yitneu b'zachira. And since women have to follow all the restrictions of Shabbat, then all the positive mitzvot of Shabbat are also. Should we decide what are the other positive mitzvot of Shabbat other than Kiddush? Is to have meals, 2 or maybe 3 meals. Okay, so that's another important one. Okay, so women also have to have, like, men have to have shalosh, women have to have shalosh, right? Whatever the obligation, that's also a positive mitzvah of Shabbat. Umotziot et anashim ho v'chayvot min haTorah kimotam. And women can fulfill the mitzvah on behalf of men, because women are obligated from the Torah just as men are. So this shouldn't surprise you. This is a pretty straightforward read of all the sources we've seen. Women are obligated just as men, and women can fulfill the mitzvah on behalf of men. It's also worth, in terms of fulfilling a mitzvah on behalf of somebody else. That's also a good topic that we, we're sort of assuming that you can fulfill a mitzvah on behalf of someone else. That's also it's sort of interesting, right? That's like a whole theology of that, right? It's not every. You can say the words and drink the wine, and I listen to you and say amen, and I fulfill my mitzvah. Like, that's interesting, right? But
Right.
okay.
Well, we can foreshadow that, right? That there is this idea of arivut that what does arivut mean? It's like being like a guarantor for somebody. It's like we all have like a special connection. And so that's actually what the idea of being able to fulfill the obligation on behalf of someone else is based on, right? Like, you and I were connected by this mitzvah bond. And so you do the mitzvah and I get the benefits because we're connected in that way.
Yeah. For many, right? For many or most.
It doesn't work for everything.
Right.
Yeah. Tzedakah is the classic example where it does not exactly work that way. Right.
Or it's filling. I can't, right? You can't, if it's a bodily mitzvah, I can't do it on. Okay. The Mishnah Berurah, this is now we're really jumping. Okay, this Mishnah Berurah is turn of the 20th century. He dies in the early 1930s. This otherwise known as the Chafetz Chaim, but after his other great book, Rabbi Meir Kagan from Lithuania. And sort of 2 points that he sort of just takes so that I think are worth sort of noting. One is, since women are obligated just as men are, then adult women are obligated just as adult men are. A woman who, he's sort of pushing back against a common practice that he observed of women who are without, living. Let's say a woman whose husband is away for Shabbat or is no longer alive, and she's at home with her young children. So there was a practice that she would have her 10-year-old son make Kiddush, because she was used to her husband making Kiddush, and he's away. And Mishnah said, no, you can't have a 10-year-old boy can't make Kiddush. He's not obligated in it, so he's not bar mitzvah yet. But the mother, she should make Kiddush for her household because she's equally obligated. And so that's one point the Mishnah Berurah adds in. The other, missing page, there it is. The other, another sort of point at the end. This is if you see in Hebrew the dal, in English the 4. He does. Again, he's commenting. This is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. He says, "Motziot anashim, women can fulfill the obligation for men." However, he says they can't eskim lataz again for ham, and all these other people agree to that. When we call nonetheless, nonetheless, it's good to be strict and not for women should not fulfill the obligation on behalf of men. L'chatchila meaning in an ideal world, all things being equal, best possible options. Women should not fulfill the mitzvah for men. Women should not fulfill the obligation for men who are not in her household because of zila milta. It cheapens the mitzvah.
No, it's about his dignity. Right. Okay.
Because he's
right.
Okay, you want to? I just got to.
I have a lot to say about zila milta. I'll say it at a different time.
Okay. So it's because he's allowing his wife, or he's allowing a woman in his household to say Kiddush, he should really do it himself. He should be.
No, it's the opposite. It's for men who are not part of her household. This is the opposite of the earlier source, right? Which is interesting to note, right? He flips it. So he's not quoting from the book, from the source that we saw earlier, because he says literally the opposite, right? He says she shouldn't make Kiddush for, right, shalot she'einam mibnei beita, which implies,
Within her household, it's okay.
that in her household, it's okay, which I think is so interesting because, and you can tell me if you know otherwise, I don't know of, this is not a practice that I have seen. In other words, I have been present for many a debate about whether or not women should say Kiddush. Usually it's not based on Zila Milta. Usually it's just based on an incorrect understanding of the mitzvah. But be that as it may, like I've never heard anybody say, oh, like right now we're in Princeton Hillel, so we can't have a woman make Kiddush. But like obviously if I were home in my house, then like, I'd make Kiddush for everyone. Right? Like I don't know of people who preserve actually the practice.
You wouldn't, how would you know? There are women who only make
I've
Kiddush at
never
home.
been to the home, right? But nobody's ever made that argument, right? Which I think is interesting.
Yeah. So what's Zila? What's the Zila Milta that's in public but not in private? How does it, I don't know, Zila lessons, right? It cheapens. What's the cheapen? How would you?
Yeah, I think probably as I read it, but again, we can talk a lot more about Zila Milta another time. I think that maybe the idea is like, well, in private, like, like if we're married, then like I know that you know how to say Kiddush and you know that I know how to say Kiddush, but like one of us has to say Kiddush, right? Which, I mean, whatever, not really, right? We talked about this, like in theory, we could both say Kiddush, but like, let's say in the interest of time, only one of us is going to make Kiddush, so we just have to choose. But you know that I know and I know that you know. But if we're in public and a woman gets up and makes Kiddush, again, I think maybe then there's this feeling of like, wait, is there really not a man in this space who knows how to make Kiddush, right? That it's Zila Bei Milta in that sense.
Another thing I want to point out in the Mishnah Berurah also says lechatchila, in an ideal world, this is how it should happen. But let's say you were just in your imaginary dialogue, you're saying, I know that you know, and you know that I know, everyone, everyone's great, but one of us is going to make it. Like, what if the man doesn't know? What if there isn't a man who can say it well or can say it right? Like in that, right? So that's also just important. That there's clearly by the time of the Mishnah Berurah, in the context of the Mishnah Berurah, men were saying Kiddush much more frequently than women, even so that he has to push back against women without husbands home having their children say Kiddush. So clearly there was like a social expectation that men were saying Kiddush and not women more commonly in his time. And even so, like that, so he's really like, that's not the only, that social expectation is not the highest priority. The highest priority is that Kiddush should be said by a Jewish adult effectively and accurately, I think. Right. Okay.
It also sounds like you can only say it one at a time. That you can't have both. You can't both do it simultaneously.
You can both.
One has to do it. One.
You could go through it simultaneously. You just can't say amin to your own bracha. Right. That's why I was saying sort of like maybe it's like in the interest of time, right? If you're only going to have one person making Kiddush, then for whatever reason, right, you've decided that, then you have to choose. But like it is certainly an option to have multiple people making Kiddush. Even either simultaneously or serially, right? In other words, we could say, listen, there's, whatever, 10 of us in a room, why choose, right? Like, it's not really fair for me to make Kiddush for you or you to make Kiddush for me, right? So we could each Kiddush.
And you can, we can also finesse that, which we're going to, I used to spend a lot of Yom Tovim in a Hasidic oriented neighborhood in New York, and it was very common there for each head of household to make his own Kiddush for the members of his household, even if like 3 or 4 families were sitting around the table, people would take turns making Kiddush. And I think actually when we first got married, at every meal I would say, anyone want to make their own Kiddush? And like no one did for like the first 5 or 6 years that we were married. So I stopped occasionally, but like I whatever. So also, if you're at a communal meal and everyone is lifting their cup with wine or grape juice and singing along together and saying all the words together, then actually you're making your own Kiddush. And so that's the way you can sometimes, which in sometimes some settings could be helpful to finesse who is fulfilling the obligation on behalf of whom. If everyone is singing along, reciting the words together, then we're all saying, I'm saying Kiddush for myself. We're all saying Kiddush for ourselves in that setting. But we'll circle back to that later. Aruch HaShulchan, I'll say outside, like one sort of, just note, the Aruch HaShulchan is contemporary of the Mishnah Berurah, but where the Mishnah Berurah is very presenting an ideal halacha that may not have been followed by anyone in his time. The Aruch HaShulchan, his agenda as a commentary, as a halachic encyclopedia, is to defend and explain common practice in Lithuania in the turn of the 20th century. So he says what was done. He does not include any of the Zila Milta. He doesn't seem to push back against women reciting Kiddush. He does have a lengthy discussion here about, I think, a kind of interesting dynamic that if that arevut, if that ability to do mitzvah on behalf of one another is because our obligations are equal, he points out that, well, sometimes women have greater obligations than men, or because in a household where a man goes to shul and recites the words of Kiddush in his Friday night Shabbos davening, and let's say in this household, the woman maybe not have didn't daven Mariv, and then he comes home and she has not yet recited any words of sanctifying Shabbat with her mouth. She has this like Torah obligations of Yom Shabbat. He already said the words in his davening, so he has a rabbinic obligation to say them again over a cup of wine and he's sitting down at the table, but she actually has a higher obligation than he does. And so there's like this theoretical that you know, the number of poskim sort of suggest and play with that if the woman has not daven Mariv, she has a greater obligation. So when
Even though most poskim think that's not true, right? That
That-
like that it's potentially just by lighting Shabbos candles, she's already
and maybe she comes home, he says there are a lot there's this
Good Shabbos, right.
there are many ways out. If she davened tomorrow, that's also a great way out of it. That's also good. But the Aruch HaShulchan, though, he says that no, that actually this concept of arivut, this bond that we have, all of us together, this obligation that we have in mitzvot allows a man to say Kiddush on behalf of the female members of his household who haven't davened Mariv. Even that, but also it would also work in the other direction. And the Aruch HaShulchan doesn't say anything surprising in that regard. Pri Megadim is a super commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Points out the point that the daytime Kiddush is only rabbinic. There is no Torah source for daytime Kiddush. And even so, women are obligated. This is important because all the rules we saw before about Zachor, Shamor, everyone who's obligated, and the prohibition is also obligated in the positive mitzvah of Shabbat, that only pertains to the Torah obligations. That seems to be right. We're darshaning, we're explaining, explicating verses in the Torah. So you might think that dynamic, that rule, is only relevant for Torah obligations. Like daytime Kiddush is not a Torah obligation.
Well, maybe the Kiddush is, but not the words.
The Kiddush is, but not the words,
right?
Because there are no
Yeah.
words. And nonetheless, women are obligated in that as well, because if the rabbis are legislating something, they could legislate it whoever they want. But he says that that's not the case, right? He says, Kol milei de Shabbat ish v'isha shavin. All matters of Shabbat, all Shabbat mitzvot, men and women are equally obligated, and that even pertains to the daytime Kiddush as well. And Shmirat Shabbat Kehilchata, which is a mid-20th century like encyclopedia of Shabbat rules, says men and women have to say Kiddush. Shabbat, Yom Tov, they all have obligations at night and during the day. Okay.
So just right, we wanted to talk about this for the reasons David mentioned at the outset, and also because it comes up in like basically every communal setting. It comes up in shul. In our shul here, we say Kiddush in shul Friday night. We say Kiddush in shul during the day. For those listening in from Chicago, the practice there was to say Kiddush during the day, not in the sanctuary, but in the Kiddush room. That's a whole other conversation.
It's different building.
Right, different building. But communal settings. We worked at Hillel for 5 years. I mentioned that, very intense. I've actually I was at a Wexner retreat today and yesterday, and mentioned to my colleagues that I was teaching, and immediately, like everyone was like, "Oh, I remember that from college." Like the who says Kiddush question. It's like a big Hillel question. So it comes up a lot. And then, also within families, also if you're at someone's house for a Shabbat meal, or you're having someone over for a Shabbat meal, all of those things. So I think it's important because I think it's good to know things. It's like good to know real things. So really, really, men and women are equally obligated. And if you're having an argument about that, then the other person is misinformed. And there's not really a way around that, but you can spread the truth. And then the question is what do we actually do? And there's a lot of considerations, I think, there. one, David mentioned this before, like who knows how to say Kiddush? Like who's good at saying Kiddush? Because it is actually a form of sanctifying Shabbat. It is the form of sanctifying Shabbat. It's Zochrehu al Hayayin. It's how we welcome Shabbat in. And so it's really important to like say Kiddush nicely. And that's much more important than the gender of the person saying it, right? Like you actually need to know how to say Kiddush. And then there's the question of who wants to say Kiddush, and who's eager to do that and who's not. And I think that that's also an important question, and maybe also making space for multiple Kiddushes. Again, you know, as you talked about, like I think, I don't know, I kind of think if you have like a lot of people who want to say Kiddush, so maybe institute that as a practice that a lot of people are saying Kiddush, whether it's like simultaneously or serially. And then there's a question of like, are there communal needs or family needs to be aware of? So David spoke very beautifully about going to these spaces in Kew Garden Hills, right? So I do think that women can make Kiddush, and also I do not, when we're having meals with those family friends, I do not offer to make Kiddush. I do think that in their community that would be seen as like, I don't think they would say Zila Milta, but I think that that's essentially what they would think, right? That it's an inversion of what they see as respectful gender roles. I would still argue with them if they said women weren't obligated, but I don't think they would say that because they're actually quite knowledgeable. And I think it would just be about like, you know, like what are actually the communal considerations. And so I think that those are all starting places. Yes, isn't it?
In those cases, could it come down to like the women singing issue in front of men?
Could it come down to a women singing issue in front of men? No, not really. You don't have to sing Kiddush.
Oh,
Right? I mean, even if you are singing Kiddush, it's a question whether that falls under the category of Kol Isha, but let's even cut the singing out of it and say you're just reciting Kiddush because there's no obligation to sing Kiddush. Yeah, Sara.
So what about a woman saying Kiddush and Shul on Friday night?
Friday night is sort of interesting. Kiddush Friday night fulfills nobody's obligation because it's not said at the place where we're eating. And so you could say, since it's not anyone's obligation, why not have women do it? Or you could say, since it's not an obligation, it's just a custom, maybe we're more bound by the custom. So I think it can go both directions, right? No one really knows why we say Kiddush Friday. It's a very interesting practice because why we say Kiddush and Shul. Yeah, so the Gemara talks about in the ancient, I think it's the Gemara even says this, but it's the Gemara says that in the olden days, there were, you know, people would sleep in the shul, and so for their benefit, but we don't have people sleeping in the shul. It is, but no one's sleeping in the shul now, so why are we saying it? And that seems to be a
Like it is, but also our security
and it was
freak out, right?
and it wasn't even true at the time of like when the Gemara is describing it, it was describing this practice that why are we doing this? It doesn't seem to fit the rules of Kiddush. Oh, in the olden days they used to, so it's sort of like even they didn't quite know why. In any event, it's not fulfilling anyone's obligation. So all of these rules, this whole discussion is not necessarily relevant to that question. It's more, so then you could say, well, free for all, it's not an obligation. We could do whatever we want. Or, well, it's not, it's just this custom. So let's try to conform as close as possible to the customary practices. So I think that's how
maybe it's like part of the liturgy and like person's leading davening, so they make it.
Yeah.
I've seen that argument also, but
I
don't think there's like a halachic reason why.
Right, we just think it would give, this is an opportunity to
Yeah. So that's a totally.
Also, with this like, you know,
Repeat the question.
custom on the idea that there would be a perception that the men didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
That doesn't really seem like such a relevant.
Yes.
Right. So that's for like Kiddush. Like I think what David's saying is Friday night Kiddush and Shul is not even that, right? Like nobody's worried about even that. But yeah, I agree. I mean, I think in our community, nobody would be worried about it.
So I'd say I'd just be like 3 minutes till Mara. I want to take maybe 2 of them to say, I think in terms of these types of questions, like the first level is what is the halakha? I think clearly the halakha is women can say Kiddush also for men. I think Zila Milta as a strong halachic force, as you said, is like, doesn't seem very powerful. The Aruch HaShulchan doesn't seem to embrace it, and men and women, we invest a lot of money in day school tuition for men and women. Like I think we can assume people can like recite Kiddush, but hopefully right by the time of Bar Mitzvah and Bat Mitzvah, everyone should recite a Kiddush. I think on the counter side, there is like an issue, I would like the aesthetics of Orthodoxy, or like the expectations of what people imagine they'll find in an Orthodox shul or an Orthodox home. I think that pushes us and pushes me and sometimes to be more cautious or do things in a more conventional way, because people have certain expectations and people deserve often to have their expectations met. I think in the case of Kiddush, two like counter forces. One is that you don't need the person, you can always do it's very easy to do your own Kiddush. If I come to a shul and a woman makes Kiddush and I think Zila Milta, I like the Mishnah Berurah, like I don't uphold by that. So you know what? You go downstairs and you find some grape juice and you make your own Kiddush, and that's great. Or you go to somebody's house and for whatever reason, you're not so happy with the person making Kiddush. Maybe they don't know it so well. Maybe they say wrong words in your opinion, right? So you have your grape juice in your wine in your glass, and you say the words quietly as they're saying them, and you say the words that you think that should be said, and you could make your own case. So it's really that's
stakes.
The stakes are low in this case, because it's very easy for an individual to make sure his or her needs are met when it comes to Kiddush, with just a minimal amount of we actually have been in situations where there's been like only one cup of grape juice, and Jeremy the
And we
Havdalah.
still made it work.
Yeah.
To ask him a different time to tell you the Havdalah story.
But so that to me, that's how I would sort of like the calculus, or the like work thinking through, like those are some of the factors, like the halakha I think is the most important. That's like 3/4 of maybe your decision. I think there is, like, you throw in expectations of Orthodox community and aesthetics of Orthodoxy and what people imagine that looks like, which I think you want to push back on in a like sustainable, slow, steady way, rather than in a perhaps whatever in a strategic way. And then like, so then what are the stakes actually if somebody isn't comfortable? Like, can they have their needs met? And here I think it's relatively easy. Okay.
Is kavod any possible complications, or like if you have a rabbanit or a rabbi and not a rabbi?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is kavod a possible complication? Like if there's a rabbanit present or a rabbi and not a rabbi, you offer the rabbanit a chance to?
No, I don't.
There's really no discussion of that in the sources. I think it goes back to the idea that like, it's not, there's like a joke about this. I forget which rabbi, like someone calls the rabbi and says like, I'm giving you an honor under the chuppah, rabbi, right? I'm going to like have you, say one of the 7 blessings. It's like, no, that's not really an honor for me. Like I make blessings all the time, right? Like, so I think, because anyone could, like, we hope to be in a community where there are enough well-educated people, and I feel that, we have teenagers who have a strong Jewish education, either because they've gone to day school or they've gone to Jewish summer camp, and or they've learned at home or they've learned at shul, and we have tons of adults. Like we live in a community where there's lots and lots of people who could say Kiddush, and so maybe it's an honor to be asked for like elevating that voice, but I don't think anybody who's making Kiddush is feeling like, well, like I alone can do this, right? Like I alone was chosen.
Yeah, and it's just, I think it's very, very, we have to take tomorrow, but I think it's very, there are communities where like 3 families are sharing a Shabbos meal together, and every head of household will make his own Kiddush. So that no one thinks it as the least bit disrespectful that I'm making my own Kiddush, or, that I'm going to listen to my father's Kiddush, even though like all of us are at this Shabbos table together. And then there are settings where like everyone lifts their glass and they sing all the words together, and nobody stops and thinks, what? That means that if you're all singing the words together, then each of you is making Kiddush for yourself. And, I just think that there's no need to impugn insult where none is intended, and there's no reason to, okay.
Come back next week for
next week is
Torah reading.
Torah reading, that'll be fun. Okay. Torah reading is next week, and then Megillah, that'll be fun.
Timely.
All fine. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Have
a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week we'll get on 100 of Prince.